Hey everybody, it's Tommy. Welcome to our last interview of 2021. My gosh, we have made it. I don't know about you, but I'm exhausted. This year was another difficult year and full of transition and change and growth, and I hope it was similar for you. Have a really beautiful end of the year conversation, challenging in some ways, and a gift in so many others, around the topic of decolonization with my friend Eliana. And before we get to the substance of that conversation, Eliana is a friend who is a friend, a comrade in this justice work. And I just wanted to let you know about some other opportunities that you can have to connect with Eliana through her business, Embody Inclusivity, which will be in the show notes. The first thing is a integrative social justice. It's a program called Thrive, and it's integrating social justice and decolonial practice into business and community. So if you are aspiring to shape how you operate in business, more integrated from a decolonial perspective, and you are Black, Indigenous, or a person of color, highly recommend that you check that out. And if you're a person of privilege, person deemed white, and you want to practice a form of equitable giving, there's also opportunities to engage in helping offer scholarships for this program as well. So you can follow the Embody Inclusivity link as well. And then also in a few weeks, a new course that we'll be launching talking about multiculturalism and multi-racial love, how to work with it, and the differences in relationship versus against them, because we know that different experiences can really affect how we bond in relationship with one another. So I'm really excited for all of those things. Eliana is a friend of the pod, and we've been dreaming of some really awesome community engagement, community gathering events, and hopefully we can bring you all into that very, very soon. So without further ado, our last episode of the season. We're so grateful for you. Thank you for journeying with us. To those of you who've been here with us since the beginning, thank you for sticking with us through all of our evolutions. And yeah, can't wait to see what's next. See you soon.
Hello, and welcome to Permission to Be.
Let's hit him with a remix.
Oh, well, y'all got to change that.
Yes.
What do we do?
We leave our F-bombs in, and
Let's tell some stories.
As long as white people are bound, the people in power are bound, they're going to keep us bound to the same thing that they're bound to.
Out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks, and I think out of the overflow of the spirit, the body does.
Challenge some narratives.
Why is that the best that God could offer you?
Mike made it very clear that he did not want to get any of these questions beforehand. So he is getting this question live, raw, for the very first time.
This is, and I feel like art is the expression of the heart where words fail.
Oh my goodness, I have tears. Oh, y'all are killing it.
Unfiltered.
I feel like that's gotta sound strange.
Permission to be.
Actually, my literary agent, when we were talking about what book might I write, he was like, I mean, A Black Man with Hope is an interesting book.
Oh, shit.
Hey everybody, what's up? Welcome to Permission to Be. We are so excited to be with you tonight. We have in-house a friend of the pod, first time here. You finally get to know her, the one, the only, Constanza Eliana Chinea. How are you, my friend?
Good.
Yay!
Am I on TV?
I mean, I feel like we've been kikiing like we are.
Yes.
Like all of it should have been recorded. It would have been just joy for the audience.
Joy. Yes. Thank you for having me. This is great.
Oh, yay. So, I call you Eliana most often, but you go by both. You are an activist, a speaker, decolonial educator. Let me get my words right. Pronouns she, her. How you doing?
I'm good. I was just telling y'all that there was for the first time in 20 years, there was a thunderstorm in Los Angeles. So we were just, we were just enjoying the 5 minutes of rain and thunder.
Like, there has to be some significant meaning when it rains in the desert.
Yeah, there has to be, right? It's like a detox. The liberal detox over here. West Coast liberal detox.
Oh, so we're going there. We're going there early. Cool. Definitely. We also have Olivia and Becka with us tonight.
Hello, friends.
You know. I'm feeling pretty goofy, so it's just we're gonna kiki, we're gonna kiki. So, have we had any conversations on decolonization on the podcast explicitly?
Not like just outright, I don't think.
Oh.
Like we've had like little pockets.
Yeah. We talked to our friend Caitlin Curtis. And that was sort of an entry point, but maybe we can dig a little deeper tonight. So give the audience a little, not a little. I love, in the last episode I was just editing, I was like, take some space to tell us who you are, and contextualize yourself how you want us to experience you today.
Oh, wow. Okay. So, who I am, I mean, I'm all sorts of things. I was actually kind of taking inventory of my life recently, as one does in a crisis. And I was like, oh, wow, I really have done lots and lots of things in 34 years. It's pretty fantastic. So, my family is from Puerto Rico. That is the colonial name. The decolonial name is Borinquen. And so both sides of my family have been on the island for 400 years. That's as far as back as we can trace it. So, so it's, a long lineage, ancestral lineage of 3 different cultures, but that, merged into one very proud nation. So I have that as my background, and I moved to the United States when I was about 8 years old. So English is my second language. American culture was not my first culture. So it was, you know, a little bit of a culture shock when I moved to the United States. And I like to joke around that Sesame Street taught me everything I know. Because, you know, the TV as the babysitter, and you're trying to learn English for the first time and understand everything. So, you know, PBS was everything.
Yeah. I still say I do a great Elmo impression.
Mine was Big Bird. Big Bird.
Oh.
Big Bird was my guy. So I, you know, I had somewhat of an immigrant experience. You know, a lot of people don't think that Puerto Ricans are immigrants just because of the colonial status and the territory status, but you know, it's a totally different culture. We still have kept, you know, our culture 100%. We're not Americans, and we don't consider ourselves to be Americans for the most part. Unless you're a statehooder, that's a totally different conversation. But yeah, I mean, it was different. It was real different. So I went through my assimilation process in my very young years. And when I, you know, hit high school, we first moved to the United States, I had moved to the Midwest. So when I went to high school, I was actually in the South. I was in Texas. So you know, my introduction to American culture was very white, very middle America. And it wasn't until I moved down to Texas that I was, again, surrounded by brown and black folks, a lot of Mexicans, a lot of Dominicans, a lot of Puerto Ricans. So I love that time period of my life because I really got to reclaim a lot of the culture that I was completely embarrassed about in middle America. And, you know, that kind of kickstarted my movement back towards who do I actually want to be versus what this society wants me to be? And what do I stand for? What do I want in this life? How do I want to take up space in this society? And, you know, through college, I started getting into animal rights and liberation activism and then social justice. And after Philando Castile got murdered by the police, I really went deep into the Black Lives Matter movement and, you know, Puerto Rican independence and just more social justice related things. So that's kind of like a synopsis of how I got here to the decolonial education space. I was a yoga teacher for many years. I practiced yoga for 11 years. I was teaching for about 8 or 9 of those years. And I experienced for the first time, you know, what it was like to be in an industry that really does love to spiritually bypass race and racism and systemic injustice. Like they totally wanted to divorce the two. I think now it's a little bit different. Now we're having a lot of those conversations about merging social justice and wellness. But when I first started, that was not the case. It was a lot of, we only practice toxic positivity here, toxic spirituality. You can't bring your politics in here. You can't bring social justice in here.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, like, what does spiritual bypassing in that sense or in that space look like?
I mean, from everything from we're all one race, we're all one, we don't talk about race, we don't talk about racism, we don't believe in racism, all the way to, you know, experience severe prejudice inside of yoga studios. I was really looked at as the help just because I'm Latina, I'm brown, I don't look white and have never passed for white. Most of the time I passed for Middle Eastern. And so I was getting a lot of prejudice and racism inside of the yoga studio space. At the same time, everyone was saying we're all one, we're all equal. I was experiencing the complete opposite. And so, yeah, it was a rough space to be in. There's also just a ton of cultural appropriation, as a lot of South Asians know. And so it was just really tough. And a lot of, I have to say, I did drink a lot of the Kool-Aid when I first got into the yoga space. I was totally adamant that I was practicing authentic yoga. that, you know, we were all one, that I could embrace that, you know, type of mentality. But it was one of those things where it's like, you're telling me one thing, but you're showing me another. Mm-hmm. And I just couldn't, I just couldn't like really see how my experience inside the studio was any different than my experience outside of the studio. So it was tough. And I think that experience actually helped me to get back into social justice in a really deep and meaningful way, in a way that felt like I could contribute to a conversation that was really desperately needed, that many people did not want to have. So yeah, I mean, it's been a long road.
So interesting when we take inventory and like recognize like what brings us to the present moments of our work and our activism. So what was the experience like growing up, sort of being socialized one way in Puerto Rico, moving to the Midwest, where we know like demographically is not super diverse if you're outside of Chicago.
Right.
And not to say like the Midwest is a pretty expansive area, but Illinois is where you were.
That's where I was. Yeah, that's where I landed. Yeah. You know, it's interesting because as I learn more about colorism and anti-Blackness and unpacking all of those things, I really realized how much of a privilege it was to be a brown child in Puerto Rico, where I kind of just, quote unquote, blended in to the crowd. And I didn't experience racism, like structural racism. When I moved to the United States, it was a drastically different experience. Now, all of a sudden, I had to take a look at my skin color, my hair texture, you know, the way that I spoke, the type of food that I ate, the accent in my speech. Like, all of a sudden, all of these things were bad. And so I've really, in my adulthood, have learned to unpack what that experience is, and also like the immigrant experience, but how different it is for, you know, darker skinned folks, Black folks who are Puerto Rican, who are Boricua, who had to learn all of that much earlier than I did at 8 years old. So I want to give that as context, but yeah, it was a huge shock. I mean, I remember the first time that I, you know, started to learn English. I had a very young, white, blonde-eyed, blue-eyed, blonde-haired, you know, teacher who I'm sure had the best intentions, but was like, you know, she was my introduction to the English language, to the English culture. And she really hammered it in, like, you have to pronounce these words correctly, and you have to spell them like this, and you have to say it like that. And it was interesting. It was a very interesting experience. The first time I got bullied was over my food. So I was bringing very cultural food for lunch to school. Mm-hmm. And that was the first time I got bullied, was for the smell of the food. I think it was like something very simple, like arroz con gandule. And people were just like, ew, totally grossed out, didn't know what it was. Everybody else had Lunchables, you know, like super toxic food. And I'm walking in with like super smelly.
You got the homemade mood.
I know.
Nowadays, everyone would want my food. But back then, it was like, you don't have Lunchables or Gushers or Skittles or all of this stuff. Like, you're gross. Get away from us, right? So it was that. I also remember, like, I didn't quite understand dress code. Like, that was also something very new to me. In Puerto Rico, we always wore, at the academy, we always wore, like, very traditional, like, school uniforms. And when I moved to the United States, that wasn't a thing, right? And so I didn't understand dress code. I didn't understand the weather conditions. I didn't even know what snow looked like. So I remember coming into school and also getting bullied for like not wearing a jacket when it was cold outside, or wearing dresses when everybody was wearing like pants and a sweater, or wearing sandals when everybody else was wearing boots. Like, it was just a very different type of experience. So, there's a lot of things that I have remembered now that I didn't remember for a really long time, because I think I was so traumatized by moving to the United States and having that experience, not speaking the language, not understanding my peers, not knowing people were making fun of me, but not understanding what they were saying. So, it was, I think for a long time, I really shut out that part of my life. And it's been in my adulthood that I've really unpacked it and tried to make sense of it, right? Try to make sense of, what did this little girl experience that has followed her to this day? Mm-hmm. And how do I continue to try to heal her as I manage all of these other like very adult things? So a lot of my assimilation consisted of internalized inferiority. It consisted of even, demonizing some people from my own culture, people who kept their accents versus me. I did not keep my accent. For a long time, I thought, why didn't they, lose that accent? Like, don't they know that they're going to face discrimination? Don't they want a better life for themselves? Like, that was really a thought process that I had for a long time, because that's what I was taught. I straightened my hair all throughout my life until about 5 years ago. I, was very into the beauty industry and like very white colonial beauty standards. I was a makeup artist before I was a yoga teacher, and the beauty industry really hammers it in that you have to have very European features in order to succeed. And so, that's the life that I was subscribing to, and didn't realize that a lot of the depression and anxiety that I was picking up along the way, and, substance abuse, I was an alcoholic for a really long time. I didn't realize that all of those things were due to those experiences. And I don't think a lot of, Boricuas in general who live in the diaspora, or, children of immigrants or people of color, really know that a lot of the issues that we face have so much to do with the systemic racism and xenophobia that we experience on a daily basis. It's very normal for us. So much so that a lot of times we don't even recognize that something is racist until we start to unpack it later. Unless it's like very blatantly violent and in your face, right? So much of the racism that we experience is subtle, it's normalized, and it's accepted.
There's so many layers, like just stacking up there that you detail beautifully, and we could go in any number of directions, I think.
Like 30.
Right.
Yeah.
So how does those experiences then relate to the work of decolonization as opposed to, say, something like anti-racism?
Yeah, it's a good question. And a lot of people have, that question as well, is like, what is the difference? Is there anything that makes one better than the other or anything like that? And I would say no, they're both equally as important. One is just a slightly step further than the other one. So I would say anti-racism is very much focused on dismantling the structure and the mentality of race, and the myth of race, and unpacking all of that and the experience of race and racism, versus decolonization. At least it should. I don't know if every decolonial educator is this way, but it should have a foundation in anti-racism, with the understanding that it's colonization that perpetuates oppression. So it continues it. So decolonization aims to be anti-racist at its core, but understands that racism isn't the only form of oppression that needs to be dismantled. There's also all of these other colonial structures that need to be dismantled in order to get to the collective liberation that we're all, hopefully seeking. So decolonization is really more so dismantling the mentality, the colonial mentality, and ideologies that create the structure of colonization. And colonization isn't just a government colonizing a territory or a country or even a people. Colonization continues to this day by way of economics, by way of race, by way of capitalism. So there's a lot that goes into it that most people aren't even aware of. So, anybody who says we're living in a post-colonial society is full of shit.
Yeah.
It's just that it's not a thing.
Yeah. Can you say more about the ways, I think that what we recognize, especially as we've been on our own journey through anti-racism and faith deconstruction, that at some points we're taught these really not even foundational things, but simplified history. Mm-hmm. So when you say that decolonization is economics and these other things, can you unpack what you mean more in that way? Because I would probably make this, I feel like I would be safe to make the assumption that people probably generally think the act of colonizing nations and territories is over in 2021.
Right. Yeah. And a lot of people think that's true, right? A lot of people will make the argument, for example, that Puerto Rico is not a colony, that it is just an extension of the United States because there's no longer a war, right? The war already happened, and now, papers were signed, and Puerto Rico now belongs to the United States. So it's no longer colonial. So both of those things are false, right? On paper, Puerto Rico is a colonized territory. It is not a sovereign nation. And it was actually purchased from the Spanish through the Treaty of Paris. So there's a lot of facts that go around that. But, besides that, I think there's so much Western supremacy and Western ideology that has really seeped into people's mindsets that anything that belongs to the United States is not colonized. And that also is not true. Alaska and Hawaii I consider them colonial territories, even though they on paper are states. Both of those nations were also stolen from Native people. And I would say all of America is still stolen. None of it, was ever given back to Native tribes that, it rightfully belongs to them. And so this idea that, the United States is no longer a colonial imperialist state is just false. Just because we're not at war doesn't mean that it's not colonial still. So decolonization in its, foundation is really about mindset and ideology. So it's deconstructing the mindset and ideology behind colonization and what that means and what it does to people and how people act based on that colonial mindset. So Frantz Fanon is somebody that I, have been studying for a couple of years, and he really breaks down colonial mentality all the way down to its foundation. So he's somebody that I really look up to in that sense. So I've really learned the differences between a person of color decolonizing versus a white person who is unsettling. So they're both the same, but slightly different in their approaches, which is a conversation that not too many people are having, right? We think of decolonization as like this trendy buzzword that everybody has now somewhat subscribed to, but not realizing that there are two very different approaches.
Yes.
Yeah.
So for a person to, I'm sorry, I keep asking all the questions, y'all. Feel free to tell me to shut up or bounce me off at any point. But so what immediately popped up for me is, when I hear unsettling, I'm like, and I think about settler colonialism. Is that thus saying y'all need to get your asses up on out of here? Like, what does that mean? Unsettling and versus decolonizing. Yeah. Why is it crafted into those categories?
Yeah. It's a good question. And I think that's the normal response that most people have is like, oh, you just want me to leave. And, it's like, it's half true. Yes, we would like you to leave. Especially if you are currently gentrifying an entire group of, people and nation. But let's put that aside for now. That's not technically what we're talking about. So the main thing with decolonization is that colonialism is really meant to be against people of color. So we're not colonizing European countries. We're not colonizing the Netherlands. We're not colonizing, countries that are deemed quote unquote white nations. Most of what has been colonized are, the African continent, the Caribbean, Central and South America, Guam, most
North
of the
America.
Pacific. Yeah, so we're colonizing, or not we're colonizing, but the idea behind colonization was to basically expand the British Empire, right? The American Empire. Yep. And so although other nations have had colonization prior to European colonization, most of the colonial territories actually belong to the British Empire. So Britain is estimated to have colonized like 90% of the world. That's an estimate, but it's not wildly off. It's like literally 90%. So we're talking about some very real, violent stuff, right? And
I was just going to say, let's pause and like really break down what is entailed in this act of colonizing, because it is this movement of people, and people bring things with them.
Yeah.
So like let's just kind of unpeel that back a little bit.
Right. Yeah, I think, sometimes the decolonial movement and the unsettling movement get a little bit of pushback because, for instance, like Asian countries had colonization that existed, outside of European imperialism. And that is true. We had Japan and China colonize Korea and all of these other, nations, and they went through their own decolonial attempts. So it's not to dismiss that, but it's to say that because the British Empire decided to very violently colonize nearly the entire world, that has implications and consequences that still live to this day. So I always like to kind of concise it a little bit down to my personal experience being from Puerto Rico and being Boricua, that I can tangibly see. So if you go to Puerto Rico, you're going to see a whole host of American or European owned hotels, right? Puerto Rico has really become a tourism country, tourism nation, not by choice, but forced, because it is seen, and most most of the Caribbean, most Central and South American countries are seen as the playground for the rich white folks who, want to be around the tropics, right? They want to have the beaches. They want to have their extra vacation homes in predominantly brown and black countries because they deem it as their playground, right? They think that it belongs to them. And so a lot of my nation has really become a tourist nation. And one of the main reasons it's become that is not just because it's, the colonial playground of the Western supremacist world. It's a lot of it is because the U.S. imperialism has crushed the economy so much so that we are really dependent on our colonizer. We really depend on the United States government to bail us out of things, for our food. They have restricted our agriculture all the way down so that we're really dependent on having food shipped to us. Even the food that is grown on the island has to be resold to the island. So it's actually 2 times to sometimes 4 times more expensive than it is for the United States.
Holy shit.
Because of...
Say that again.
So because of U.S. imperialism, even food that is grown on the island has to be resold to the island. So any milk, for instance, or cheese that is actually made in Puerto Rico is technically part of the United States. That is a United States product. So the United States sells it back to Puerto Rico, even though it's a Puerto Rican product. It is sold back to us at 2 to sometimes 4 times the rate. So milk that would be $2.50 in the US that is actually made in Puerto Rico would be $4.50 in Puerto Rico. So it is wild. The level.
That is fucked up.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sitting here having my mind completely blown. Like, this is a thing that is happening in 2021.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And has been happening since the 1920s. So that is the Jones Act that was passed in the 1920s that was really built out of racism and says that anything that is shipped to a U.S. territory is technically part of the United States. So even if it's shipped out or to, it is part of the United States. So the fees go up. And let's pretend for a second that Puerto Rico and the United States have just gone to war and Puerto Rico has just won its independence. Because of the 1920 Jones Act, Puerto Rico would still not be able to have food shipped to it because of the Jones Act. So people would literally be going hungry unless other world powers decided to not sanction Puerto Rico as now a sovereign nation and have food delivered to them. So this has created a very colonial structure where, again, Puerto Rico is dependent on its colonizer for its survival. So this is modern day colonization. We're not talking war. We're not talking, continuing to steal territory, land, and resources. We're talking making an entire nation dependent on the very people who stole their sovereignty from them so that they don't even seek sovereignty to begin with. That is colonization.
Enslavement.
Yes.
That just brings to mind something that I just learned last week, which was about the revolution in Haiti and what happened when they won their freedom from France.
Yes.
And then were expected that they were no longer a slave colony, and slaves were an asset. And then, so I have fought, bled, died to win my freedom. And now they were charged for their freedom because as a lost asset. Yeah. And it was just another one of those things that when I heard it, a person that I follow who teaches does a lot of history videos was talking about it. And she's never shared anything that was not historically accurate, but I just had to go look it up for myself because it just blew my mind the way people here talk about, reparations is so demonized, but yet and still here you've got a people who have been enslaved to win their freedom, and then the people who enslaved them want to levy a financial consequence for the fact that I no longer own you.
Right.
And this sounds about that ridiculous. The thing is that with Haiti, this was hundreds of years ago. And so to sit here now and hear you tell me that, oh, this is 2021. I'm speechless.
Yeah.
Thank you for educating us.
Of course. And I love that you brought up Haiti because, and I would say Haiti, because we should really be looking to Haiti as like the standard of revolution and the standard of seeking sovereignty. But that entire nation has been so demonized and so the conversation around it is so anti-Black that even Caribbean folks don't even understand how incredible it was that Haiti is a sovereign nation and what it took to get there. And I think it's done on purpose because if the rest of the Caribbean really embraced that type of revolutionary strategy, it would mean that the United States would have no territories, and they do not want that. They want to keep their playground. They want to keep us oppressed. And so there's that aspect of it. And then there's also the anti-Blackness aspect of it, right? Haiti is still seen as, a very poor country, third world country. Like, who would want to live there? Who would want to be like them? And that is also on purpose because Puerto Rico is one example, but Haiti, even though it is a sovereign nation, it has been kept poor on purpose because of the reparations, in quotes, that they have had to pay to France for their freedom, but also because of U.S. imperialism not wanting Haiti to also be the sovereign nation that it should be by way of truly being allowed to do trade, truly being allowed to have its own economics, its own politics. U.S. imperialism is not just about, capitalism. U.S. imperialism has a lot to do with the U.S. government dictating the politics of every other country surrounding it. Central America, South America, the Caribbean, Haiti, Jamaica, Cuba. Look at what the U.S. has done to Cuba. It's just so insidious. And that's the colonization that I'm talking about. So you don't have to be a U.S. territory to be colonized by U.S. imperialist powers. So I love that you brought in Haiti because we really should be looking to them as the standard. We should be emulating everything that they did. But we are not even taught about Haiti properly because of, U.S. imperialism and anti-Blackness.
Gotta catch my breath, y'all. So I'm just going to go down that natural trajectory. If we're having a conversation about decolonization and colonization, I feel like we can't not address violence within that equation. And Fanon really crafts a psychoanalytic analysis around this that I'm just beginning to study.
Yeah.
But first of all, when we think like when you're having, how do you broach the conversation surrounding violence, and why is violence even a necessary conversation as it relates to decolonization?
Yeah, I think that's the subject that no one wants to talk about. And you're actually the first person to really ask me that in a genuine way. I think a lot of people just kind of like, they like to dance around the subject. They don't even touch the subject, right? And I think it's an important one. So, you know, I think it's nuanced. I think there's a lot of privilege to living in the diaspora. So I you know, can speak freely about these things. And, you know, I'm not necessarily affected on a day-to-day basis by all of the oppression that, you know, people like all of my family members do on the island, right? So there is a level of privilege that I have that is very different from the natives who are still living there.
Yeah, and just for the audience, when you say the diaspora, what are you referencing?
Yeah, so I can break it down. So currently in Puerto Rico, currently, as it relates to people who identify as Puerto Rican, it's about 2/3 of the population actually live outside of the island. So in the United States in particular, there's around 4 million, I want to say, give or take, 4 million Puerto Ricans living in the United States, just the United States alone, versus the 3 million that are currently on the island. So there are more living in the diaspora than there are on the actual island. And again, all of that is due to colonization. There's no opportunity to work unless you are a doctor, barely, or a teacher, maybe, or you are a government official, or, you know, you have some ties to the island, right? For the most part, you're not going to be able to find a job outside of working for a hotel, again, done on purpose. And so you have to find opportunities elsewhere. Even my father, who was a professor all of his career, you know, couldn't find a job as a professor on the island, so he had to find it outside of the island, and that's why we ended up moving to the United States. That's what I mean by the diaspora. There's actually more Puerto Ricans outside of the island than there are on it. So the conversation around decolonization mostly these days revolves around just the mentality of it. How much colonial mindset do we have we internalized, mostly as people of color, because that's who colonization affects the most. But also, how does settler colonialism, you know, operate, and how can we move outside of that? There's actually a really important conversation that I'm hoping people are really starting to get into, which is the difference between an immigrant and an expat. I think expats are just rebranded immigrants, but because it's such a Western thing, like an expat is like a Western thing, right? You live in the United States and now you're an expat because you decide to move out of the United States, versus an immigrant who's coming into a European nation or a Western nation like the United States, right? So there's something about that is very colonial, even if you're a person of color, that has been internalized to where, oh, no, I'm not an immigrant, I'm an expat. There's really no difference, right? You're still immigrating. And it has a lot, for people of color, has a lot to do with the racism and the systemic oppression that we're facing inside of the United States, but we don't want to be seen as the dirty word of immigrant, right? Because we know what those connotations mean. So there's like almost like a rebranding, which is very colonial, which a lot of people don't want to touch, right? It's like the don't talk about this term, right? But that is very violent to people, like myself, who have not been able to move back to their island because the island is being gentrified by Europeans and Americans of all different races and identities. The land is being bought out. We're not able to move back. The opportunities still aren't there. Americans are working there because they are able to work from home. So they're not even giving back to the economy, the Puerto Rican economy. And that continues the cycle of colonization. There's a lot of tech companies. There was a viral video that came out recently where it was supposed to be like some sort of town hall between the native Puerto Ricans in that town and a tech company that was coming in, pretending that it was going to give opportunities to the natives. And all they ended up doing was hiring more Americans to come in and work for the company, to move to the island, buying up houses at jacked up prices, renovating them, pricing the natives out. So, and the people who owned this tech company were actually people of color. So it's this colonial mindset that continues to shift. And just because you're from the West doesn't mean you're not still perpetuating a lot of the same colonial standards that you have been taught in the West. So there's a level of violence there that needs to be talked about, but then there's also just straight up violence, right? Revolution is violence.
So let's like define violence though. Like when we're talking about violence, how would we even define that to begin with? Yeah. So I think, for me, I think it is violent. Gentrification is violent. Mm-hmm. It is creating a level of trauma that may not be, so in your face visceral, where somebody is literally being removed from their home in front of a television crew or media crew, crying, all of those things. Just because we don't see that doesn't mean that gentrification itself isn't violent. People are being priced out of their homes. People who have been wanting to move back home because of, Hurricane Maria, which happened about 5 or 6 years ago by now. Environmental racism because of lack of opportunities. People who want to move back can't. That is very violent. To force a people to move out of their homes into a culture that they don't necessarily understand, that doesn't want them there, and then to revoke their right to move back because you are now continuing to buy their land, jack up the prices, and continue oppression. That is violence, right? Right. Yeah. And that's the key that when you said the force part is the thing that I wanted to really like sink our teeth in on, because it's very much like people get called racist and they have this visceral reaction to it, but it's just a descriptor. Right. That violence is just this descriptor that articulates how something happens and with what force, or the effect of that force on that thing happening. Yeah. And so we can talk about violence in a number of ways, and violence is more prevalent around us than we give credence to, but we generally only contextualize it in a very specific way. Right. People think violence, in order to qualify as violence, it has to be explicit, but a lot of times violence is very implicit. And it's very covert, because if the United States truly showed you how its imperialist ways were enacted, you would never want to be a part of the United States, right? Like it would be so incredibly traumatizing just to you as a citizen that you wouldn't even want to be a part of that, right? Some of us don't have a choice. But to those of you who do have a choice, you may not want to be a part of that anymore because you see it, if it was explicit all the time, right? But most of the time it is not. Only 1% of the time do you actually see it being very explicitly done. Yeah. And so I think Fanon's position is that because the force, the mentality, the mindset, the actions, the practice of colonization, of taking body and self and weapons to another and forcibly removing, erasing their language is done under such violent conditions, the act of decolonizing our minds, ourselves, our bodies, and unsettling ourselves will be equally violent. How do we hold those? Yeah, I think that's something I'm exploring in real time, because I think so much of this work is so internal. It's a lot of unlearning, a lot of realizing, a lot of unpacking, a lot of unlearning, and a lot of acknowledging. And that can feel really traumatic in itself, right? You have this trauma of forced assimilation, of forced colonization, and now
it feels very traumatic to have to learn that all of these things have happened to you and try to contextualize that and process it. And then also unlearning it, because you too have perpetuated some colonial shit. And so how do you reconcile that as an oppressed oppressor? So it becomes like a very weird, space all of a sudden. So in real time, that's what I'm, currently processing. And a lot of times I'm very overwhelmed. Most of the time I have to like really recommit to this work because it can feel very, very heavy. And, it's a good question. Like, how do you process the fact that, all of it is violent, right? The process of unsettling and decolonizing is violent, right? Like it is a force. You almost have to force yourself to keep on learning because so much of the colonial mentality has been normalized. It's like a part of everyday life. And, very similar to anti-racist work, a lot of people don't want to do it because it means that they would have to radically shift the way that they operate, not only relationally, but also business-wise. How you earn your money has to shift. The way that you engage with community has to shift. The way that you look at other nations, politics has to shift. So it can be really in your face. So, what I always say is that it's a lot easier to stay with the devil than to try and like go through the darkness and try to learn something new. I don't really ever fault people who start the decolonial learning and then decide, nope, can't do that anymore because it's traumatizing me. I'm upset all the time. I feel like I can't have fun. Like the things that I used to like, I can't like anymore because it's colonial. Like, how do I, do this thing, right? So I don't ever fault anybody who goes through that. At the same time, though, I think that it's important to understand where you fall in this conversation and in this, where you fall as far as wanting liberation and really seeking it out. Because it's one thing to know that you're oppressed and not do anything about it because it's the devil, versus to know that you're oppressed and actively seek out liberation. And liberation is hard. Like, what does it look like to be free? Most of us don't know. Most of us haven't seen it. Our ancestors would look at us and say, oh, you're definitely free. But we know that oppression still exists and it looks very different for us. And so I think it's a constant processing of where do I want to be? How much does liberation actually mean to me? And how can it look like in this colonial space? And what is my positionality within the decolonial part of it? Because in order to decolonize anything, it's gonna take a large group of people. So it's a tough conversation, and I don't have all the answers. But that's what I love about decolonization is that I constantly get to seek the answers that I'm looking for, and it requires collective discussion.
Yeah, I love that, and it was when you made that analogy about the devil that. It made me think about recently quitting my job and the emotions and the trauma that came up with that and this decision that I had to make. I reached a certain point. And I actually had to get a therapist and process this through with. And one of the things that she was saying, whenever we set ourselves toward a new pattern that hasn't been charted before, that we don't have any reference point, our body is going to receive that as danger and send off the alarm bells because we're having to create new pathways in our brain of something that we've never done before. And so one of the things that we haven't talked about with you today and that you alluded to at the beginning is sort of I always say sort of. One of the things that you did allude to was the struggle that all these forces, colonization, assimilation, has subconsciously on your mental health.
Mm-hmm.
And so many of us arrive at this work from that perspective of some sort of faith or spiritual deconstruction, and integrating that for me with what I believe as like to be, wholly human is to connect this mind, body, and this spirit thing that we can't articulate, but we know needs some sort of care. What has that looked like for you in your decolonial framework?
Mm-hmm. Messy. It looks very messy. It's been tough. I think, if I really had to take a look at my life and see, when my depression started, which really was very young, probably around the time that I started to move to the United States and go through, that culture shock, and how I handled it then was to get closer to that colonial standard. It was to get closer towards whiteness, closer towards that, not American, but, Western supremacist.
American dream, yes.
American dream, the West is, our savior, and they can do no wrong. And, you can be rich here, you can make it here, you can do all the things here, right? It was to get really, really close to that as I could. And at the same time, what I wasn't realizing is that it was making me suffer even more, because I was never going to hit that standard. It was never going to happen for me, not in the way that they created it, because they don't want me to get there, right? They don't want us to get there, people of color to get there. So it's that dangling the carrot and constantly chasing it, but you never quite get the carrot, right? That's what the U.S. Does to us. And so I didn't realize that it was making me suffer more, which actually made me hit the bottle and, go through that whole process. And so versus now, where I'm going through this, what feels like very traumatic unlearning, processing. How am I going to, continue to do activism? How am I going to continue to move in this world? Capitalism exists and it's a thing. And how do I, exist in the structure and not wanting to be a part of the structure? Like all of these things create a lot of overwhelm, and it becomes very messy to try to go through the mental gymnastics that you're constantly going through. And how I've, dealt with it now, honestly, hasn't been too far off from what I did before, which is, again, clinging to whatever colonial thing I knew existed, which, for me is not the bottle anymore. I've been sober for, 7 or 8 years, maybe longer. But it does still look like wanting to cling to the cure, right? Like wanting to cling to, for a while it was medication. So wanting to cling to medication to like relieve me of all of this sadness, relieve me of all of this grief. And actually, the conversation around grief for people of color, there is a book called Racial Melancholia. If you've never heard of it, I would highly suggest it. It is an incredible, incredible theory created by an Asian author and educator. And he basically, racial melancholia is this grieving of something that you haven't quite ever touched or felt or seen, but you know that it's there. It's like a loss of culture, a loss of identity, because it's constantly being stripped away from you. At the same time, you're not white, so you're never going to be white. You're never going to, be a part of that structure, that racial, structure. And so it creates this level of grief that is untangible. You can't really see it, but you feel it all of the time. He's a fantastic author, and he explains it, really, really well. So I would definitely say to Google that. But, it's not too far off. And so what I've realized is that because colonization is all that we know, our first step is to get a little bit closer to it. But in the decolonial process, you get closer to it, you examine it, you notice it, you become more aware of it quicker. So then you can take a step back and decide, okay, it's not working and it's never going to work. So I need to try something else. I need to get closer to community. I need to get closer to some mutual aid. I need to reach out for help. I need to destigmatize mental health, because that's a thing. And the wanting and reaching, at least for me personally, the wanting and reaching for substances, that outside thing that's going to make me on the inside feel better and happier about my existence in this fucked up world, that wanting to cling to that, again, is a very colonial concept, because our ancestors, our indigenous ancestors, didn't have that, right? They didn't have outside things to make them feel better. All they had was themselves and their environment, and they had to make that work. And so, it's that a friend of mine calls it re-indigenizing ourselves. And like,
I've heard a similar, Dr. Greg Carr, he puts emphasis on remembering.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I love that. And I'm constantly thinking about that. Like, how can I re-indigenize the way that I treat my mental health, the way that I treat my body, the way that I treat my relationships. And it's messy. It's freaking messy. And I don't do it correctly all the time, or correctly, whatever that is. But
right. Yeah, that perfectionism concept.
Perfectionism, right? Like, oh, you have to do it right or wrong. And, I don't always do it in a way that feels aligned, I should say. But the great thing about it is that the deeper I get into this work, yes, the more I'm unpacking and the more uncomfortable I get. But also, I feel like I'm getting closer to the thing that I'm looking for that is way further away than, again, the devil that I know. And it feels more aligned. So every day I'm getting closer and closer to the thing that is actually going to make me feel like I'm actually me, and it's okay to be me. I don't have to strive for anything. I don't have to prove anything. That is hard in social media. Social media world. Yeah.
It's programmed.
It is so programmed
to do just that.
Exactly.
Right?
And to compare yourself and to constantly be out there, constantly be seen. Look at all the things I'm doing. Look at all the things I'm teaching you, right? That it's hard, right? And especially when people look at you as an educator and that's what you do, that's what you love to do. But all of a sudden you're not teaching, or you're taking a break. It can be really difficult, right? To remember who you are, that in your essence, you're not here for anybody else. You're here for you. You're here for dismantling. You're here for disrupting colonial systems. But that doesn't have to be on anybody's timeline. Yeah, it's messy work.
I guess let's bring it around.
Well, can I say one thing?
Yes,
Tommy?
absolutely, please.
What you say when what you're looking for is very individualized or unique, not individualized, wrong word, unique to you.
Yeah.
And unique to Tommy. Because I feel like another aspect of supremacy culture and capitalism is the thing we're looking for is all the same. Right. We're looking for the same thing, and so this journey, I just wanted to talk about, if you can say just a little bit about that, because I think the assumption our brains, not everybody, but a lot of the assumptions our brains go to is we're looking for that thing, the same thing.
Right.
That's good. Yeah.
And okay, so there's the thing of that exists, that is very real. And it's this concept of individualism, right? Mm-hmm. It's all, everything that happens to me, and it's only important because it's my experience, right? That's individualism. And that is very toxic. And I don't know, I haven't studied it too much, but my guess is that, that individualism is actually what fed racism, and imperialism and capitalism and all that stuff. So there is that, and that's the extreme of it, right? But you're right. There is this level of, you know, we all want the same thing, right? And we all have to get there the same way. And it's interesting because I have a mentorship program that I offer to people of color who are in wellness, who are wanting to decolonize. And one of the biggest uncomfortable things that they tell me is that I'm not giving them straight answers. They're like, I want you to tell me what is right and what is wrong. I want you to tell me what is
ABC.
What is the right way to decolonize and what is the wrong way to decolonize. And I can't give you that. You know, there's definitely more colonial ways of doing things and more decolonial ways of doing things. But the binary of good and bad, that is a religious, you know, thing, doctrine thing that we also need to get rid of. And so once we dismantle that, then we get to the basis and the foundation of, oh, actually there is no good or bad. There's just doing and not doing, right? Or causing less harm, causing more harm, right? It's not, you know, we could consider causing more harm being bad and causing less harm being good, but at the same time, it's like, it's impossible not to cause harm at all. So, you know, it just is. And so that level of nuance and complexity is very uncomfortable for people. People want that perfect answer. I want you to tell me how to do it and tell me how to do it correctly. And if I disagree with you, I'm right and you're wrong. Right? And a lot of us subscribe to that. A lot of us subscribe to that. So yes, there's individualism on the toxic end of things. And there's this level that we have subscribed to that says, you know, if we're doing things right or if we're doing things wrong, we all should do the right thing. We all should do the good thing. We should all try to be good people, whatever that means, the morality complex.
Right.
So the thing that I want people to remember is that we all have had different experiences. So the way in which we get to this end road of decolonization, which really isn't an end road, it's just a continuous road, is going to look different for different people. So what aligns with me may not necessarily align with you, may not necessarily align with Tommy, may not necessarily align with Olivia. So it means that we're all going to be at different points at many different times. And so in the decolonization process, those of us who want, for instance, Puerto Rican sovereignty, we're all going to come to that point at different times with different strategies, with different complexities, with different nuances, with different biases. So does that mean that we shouldn't seek sovereignty or we shouldn't seek liberation? No. It just means that we're going to be in multiple different communities at multiple different times who have different strategies, who have different approaches, who have different healing modalities, different healing tools, different ways of being that are going to align with us at one point or another. And because we're all doing it together, that means all of us together will eventually get to that place where we feel, okay, I've landed.
And rooting into the decolonial strategies for being in conflict through that difference.
Yes, which is a conversation that you and I have had multiple times. And that's the part of it, right? A lot of people think, oh, it's only truly decolonial if everybody is on the same page, nobody disagrees, everyone's doing it perfectly, right? Like community is the be all end all, without realizing, again, different people are coming in with different biases, different traumas, different ways of being, different experiences. And there's inevitably going to be conflict. And how we deal with that conflict is this road of causing more harm or causing less harm. But we're all, as long as we stay on the train, we're eventually gonna get there, right? But a lot of people just jump off the train because they're like, nope, it's too uncomfortable to be in conflict with people. I disagree with this person. I disagree with that person. So I'm no longer doing this thing. And that's what's fundamental.
And I want to say, like, that's actually normal, right? That's our fight, flight, freeze, fawn responses in action. And like, so when, you know, we weren't taught in school that we would be fighting against our bodies when we were learning about this stuff. Yeah. And so the embodied experience of creating a society in which we all can breathe, in which we all are rooted into our inherent dignity and worth as human beings is is going to expose those places we've been wounded,
right,
by systems and structures.
Yeah.
In talking about that wounding, this is all heavy work. So what sustains you? What sustains spirit for you?
Yeah.
Especially, I ask that question because I know, like, I come from a Christian background, and I know that that's not your shared background. And so what
it actually
are those...
is. Yeah, I was raised
okay. Sorry, I said it wrong. Yeah. So, like, yeah, how does that then, let even go a different direction? How does that being raised Christian now play into your journey of decolonization and feeding your spirit?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I think, just on the journey of attempting to have some sort of connection to spirit, I have looked towards like things that look very religious and perhaps have been very religious to, try to get there. So, I was raised Christian. I studied Buddhism for a little while as a yoga teacher. I was, learning a lot of Hinduism by way of yoga philosophy. Taoism. I've read the Tao. So I really seeked a lot of different types of spiritual religions in order, because again, it's the devil, if you don't like this devil, you go to a different one. And so, but it all looks the same, right? It all feels very like doctrine, right? And so when I decided, that doesn't align with me, I've tried multiple things, but it's not what I'm looking for. It doesn't align with me. So being in a place now where I'm really going through a reclamation process, meaning I'm really going deeper into elemental spiritual practices that aren't tied to anything or any god or any gods.
Say that.
Yeah, it's very, I've always been attracted to water. What is that about, right? So like getting closer rather than further away. What is water? What is the element of water? Why does it feel so good? Why do I want to be close to it? How can I get even closer? And really building that type of relationship with nature. I tend to be more of a hermit. I like being cozy in my home. So I really have to push myself to go out into nature a lot of the time. But what is that about, right? Like, why do I feel so cozy at home? Why do I not want to go outside more often? What am I afraid of? What is that about, right? And so that's my spiritual practice now. It's like very elemental, back way, way down to its roots. In my reclamation process of my ancestry, it's actually a very Taino practice, which actually is part of my ancestry, one of the three. And so that's very exciting. It actually feels exciting to be learning about that stuff. But also, since I was a child, I've always been, an animal lover. Like, if I had to be in a room full of people versus in a room full of animals, I'm going this way. I love animals. So I have a lot of them, as many as I can have. So I have my 2 dogs. I've got my 2 guinea pigs, and I just love it. I love spending time with them. A lot of people, talk about meditation, and for a long time with my yoga practice, my meditation looked very similar to what you see on TV. It's, your eyes closed, you're just kind of getting into it, right? You're getting into yourself. And I never quite understood why I couldn't really get too deep in that. I'm a very anxious person. I move around, I fidget. It's very uncomfortable for me to just be in silence for a really long time. But what I've realized, especially since getting my guinea pigs, is I actually meditate with my animals. So I will literally spend 30 minutes to an hour with my dog, just cuddling, looking at her, processing this life, right? Like, that's my meditation practice. When I'm looking at my guinea pigs, I could stare at them for hours, and that is my meditation practice. Like, it just looks different than other people's. And so I'm really learning to embrace that side of it, and learning that it's okay sometimes to want to disassociate from society and just be like, nope, I'm spending time with my animals today. Like, I'm not doing this today, world. I'm spending time at home with my guinea pigs, with my husband and my partner. That's what my spiritual practice looks like these days. And And I'm really learning to embrace that, like not looking outside of myself for anything. You know, especially on the days, and Tommy and I have had these conversations privately about, you know, addiction and what that looks like and feels like on a daily basis, even if you're sober. Those addictive tendencies still exist. They're still there. And so managing that in a way that is aligned with me feels, even in the uncomfortableness, feels more comfortable than trying to seek it outside of myself, which is not only uncomfortable, it is just draining. It's so draining. So I'm, you know, for now, I'm done with that, right? And I've only been able to get there by allowing myself to get there. Versus before, I was just like, you know what? I got to survive the day. Anything. Let's do Red Bull. Let's do vodka. Let's do weed. Let's do antidepressants, right? Anything just to survive the day. I can't handle it. Let's just do it. And I feel like I've gotten to a point where I've just allowed myself to sit in my discomfort and really just muddle in it and meditate in there and realize that, you know what, this is a feeling that I need to be in for a little bit. And I'm, you know, the more I explore it, the more I'm able to see how to get out of it. Mm.
What you said about animals, there's a time where, like, I would have been like, what? But this is not that time. So I'm about to say the exact opposite. You know, it so resonated with me. I think it was like 3 weeks ago. One of my good friends had just shared some information that was all factual, completely true. And it just so unmoored me. Sometimes too much truth just makes my head hurt. And so I wrote this Facebook post that said, so I said, my friend sent me some information that was depressing AF, you know what the AF stood for. So I went for a walk and bonded with a horse, actually 2 horses. And there's a time when I would have thought that was the most ludicrous thing, but I had this whole spiritual experience with these 2 horses. And I actually have video clip. I mean, this horse, he came up to the gate. He's reaching over. He's kissing me on the cheek. And then the other one comes up and is actually dipping his head under the gate to draw me in. And so now I want a horse. But I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Oh, my husband is obsessed with horses. But unfortunately, my neighborhood does not allow that. But here's the thing, how when something is on your radar, you notice it. So I was 2 hours away this day that I went walking and had my horse bonding experience. But now every time I get in my car, I'm like, oh my God, there are horse pastures like all out here in this area that I live. I live in an area that I live in Metro Atlanta, but it's very residential. And so there are several horse pastures. So I am seriously going to figure that out because you just had to be there. Yeah. And, you know, there was a fence and they were far behind the pasture. And so they had to gallop across. And I just really felt like they were trying to talk to me. So that's what I thought about when you talked about your guinea pigs. I was like, I just had a horse bonding experience. I totally resonate with what she's saying. And
it's so true. Yes, it's so true. We actually, the guinea pig rescue where I got mine, they also rescue other types of animals, and horses are one of them. And recently, and Tommy knows about this one, I had a very rough experience with attempting to hold a very large and popular white lead account on Instagram accountable for their, you know, xenophobia. And I was just knee deep in depression. I was totally like sinking. And so we went to the guinea pig rescue just so I could, you know, have some time off. I had already pre-scheduled it. Like it was the thing, it was my day. And actually my husband, we were touring and we came over to the horses, and he just, again, just like you, was having a full moment with this one horse. And it looked like they were about to get married.
I have video evidence of mine. I mean, I actually have video evidence of this horse leaning over, kissing my face. It was just surreal, and I just felt so loved.
Yeah.
And
you're just having this connection and this moment, and it is completely silent. Mm-hmm. And you don't have to say anything. You don't have to prove yourself. You don't have to tell them where you work or how much money you're making or how many Instagram followers you've got. It is just you and the animal just having a moment and a deep, deep connection. And it is beautiful. And I've always been that way. My mom used to joke around. When I was younger, we literally used to have arguments about how much time I would want to spend with my animals versus how much time I would want to spend with my family, because I've just always been drawn to animals. I don't have to prove anything to them. Yeah. You know, I'm just there and they just love me for being there. And that's so beautiful. So, and it's the same way I feel about the ocean and water. You know, I'm just there. I don't have to prove anything to the ocean. I don't have to tell you, anything. They don't even care about, the worst thing that happened to me today. They're just happy I'm here. The ocean is just happy that you're there having an experience. And that's so beautiful.
I will have to tell you one of the most beautiful things I've heard about water, but I'm going to say I'm not going to tell you on this podcast because Eliana will be back.
Oh.
And we're talking with Eliana and some other beautiful, beautiful people about opportunities for you all to connect more personably in community with us. Mm-hmm. And so there'll be some behind the scenes conversations and some other fun stuff that we're going to co-create together and continue this work of being and lifting up humanity. Thank you so much for the joy you brought today.
Thank you. Oh my goodness.
Let people know how they can be in relationship with you.
Yes.
These days.
Absolutely. So I have a Patreon that has been going on for a little while now. So it's a really great community there. So it's patreon.com/Constanza Eliana. And I am on Instagram, however, not for too long. So do find me on there so you can figure out how to follow me other places. And I have my website, embodyinclusivity.com, which is constantly going through changes and updates and all types of things. I also have an activist apparel line on there. So you can wear your activism proudly with some shirts and mugs and letters. Yeah, so that's how you can stay in touch.
And we'll list all of that in the show notes as well, so everybody will have access to all those links.
Yeah.
So good. This was so good. I always love talking to you.
You too.
You just never know where the conversation's going to go.
I know. It's like, I'm going to take you all sorts of places. We're going to go all directions.
All right. Till next time, yo.
Yes. Thank you for joining us on Permission to Be. You can learn more about today's guest by going to permissiontobepodcast.com. We are also on all the social medias. You can find us on Instagram and Facebook at Permission to Be Podcast or Twitter at permission_to_be. We would love to hear from you and let us know who you might want to have on as our next guest. If you will leave us a rating and review, in your review, you can put the name of people or persons who you think might be a great guest for the Permission to Be podcast. We hope you have a wonderful day.
Who is that?
No, that was motorcycles racing down my street. Because I live in the city.
Somebody is blowing some snots out. That sounded like it felt good. I was like, whoa, go in those passages.
It did sound like somebody was just blowing their nose.
No, I've got there's a 4-lane street in front of our house, and I don't know what we used to back in the day call them crotch rockets. There's no stoplights.
That's not back in the day. It's still very much.
It's still there.
Day.
Okay. I'm like, I don't know because I haven't been around. But anyways, so
you haven't been around the millennials and the Gen Zers.
Back in my day.
I am the senior citizen here. So I am neither a millennial nor a Gen Zer.
But anyways, they race because there's a light that's 1 block from us, and then there's no light for probably a good solid half mile to close to a mile. So,
well, that's a daily annoyance.
Yeah, it's normal.
Yikes.
I forget about it.
Yeah.
It's not like, I'm like, oh. You're like, what was that? I'm like, oh, it's just a motorcycle.
The crotch rocketeers.
They're just they're going. Yes, Tommy, what would you like to say? There's so much in your face. So much.
Nothing. I was just like, crotch rocketeers. This sounds like a thought I would have in the shower like the other day when I was just thinking about how like we should just retire the use of cockpit.
Yeah.
Spit water all over my computer.
Is that what we're leading with cock discussions?
All right.
Where did the name cockpit come from?
Oh, trust me, toxic masculinity.
Fair enough. Just like the dick spaceships.
Hey, welcome to Permission to Be.